I am Kelly Ford Lau, and we're in Las Vegas, Nevada, specifically North Las Vegas, here at KellySOMM, my wine company that I founded in, just 2 years ago, actually, about this time 2 years ago, so 2020. And it's an e-commerce wine company. Not that e-commerce is new, but e-commerce was new to Nevada up until I started exploring the license, which no one had ever asked for, which is also a curious thing.
Tell me, what's your take on the Las Vegas market for wine?
So Las Vegas is unique because we do a couple things really well. Las Vegas historically has been a very high volume wine market, high volume in those lower price points, but also a very lucrative trophy market for New Year's, Chinese New Year's, any of the large gamers that come in that want those fine and rare bottles that often are hard to get. This city also does well. What we historically have not done particularly well is nurture portfolios that are smaller, that have, 5-10 cases of something come into the market, specifically Nevada, maybe where, typically some interesting wines will go into those more mature coastal markets that are more developed. Where Nevada, we want those wines, but we don't always do right by those wineries or portfolios. Sometimes they get forgotten about, which is a short answer.
Yeah. But what in your opinion makes a good sommelier?
Caring about the wine and the people behind it. And also, of course, being personable is the next, and good with tableside manner. And also, of course, wanting to connect the producers you care about with the people that are your audience for that evening.
Okay. You have the option to do formal sommelier service, or you have retail wine sales. What is KellySOMM attempting to do in the marketplace?
So, wow, truth be told, I really enjoy all facets that you mentioned, the, service side, the sales side, but KellySOMM is something different in the sense that it is e-commerce, so I don't have the opportunity to connect with my customers face to face. It is through them, of course, knowing that I exist, and then communicating with either the listings that I already have or reaching out to me directly so I can help curate a selection for them, which I really enjoy that. But mainly it's an e-commerce platform, but coming from a lens of wines that sommeliers traditionally care about. Wines that you normally would only find on a restaurant list. And it's not that these wines aren't available anywhere else retail, but they were historically not available retail in the Las Vegas market specifically. And so the impetus for KellySOMM was to nurture some of these producers and these small portfolios that suppliers represent, and make sure that if they are in the market, not that I'm the only game in town, because there's other buyers who want to work with these wines, but that I could be one place for them to go. And not only can those who live in Nevada have access to them from my website, but also the other 6 states that I service. And so it also is important that I'm sourcing from distributors and suppliers who are in Nevada, because without that, there's a lot of different places that you can go buy wine. Of course, if you're a captive audience in a restaurant setting, you have to buy from that program that you're the guest at. But when it comes to online, you can shop. There's hundreds of online retailers, but I just wanted to make a difference for this market. It is a more savvy and economical decision to base an e-commerce store out of California, so you can have that, that broad reach. I want to say it's 46, 47 states they can ship to, where the reach that I have access to currently is 7 states if you include Nevada, but that's just a function of being physically located in Nevada and how those interstate shipping laws are currently written. But they also change from time to time, so I'm optimistic that perhaps the reach could be broader one day. It just might take time. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely. What would you say some of the differences between like consumer palettes in say like a New York City or like a San Francisco versus like Las Vegas and more suburban people? Like where is that conversation going, and just your thoughts on any of that stuff?
Historically, here in Las Vegas, wow, I mean, Las Vegas is changing so fast. I remember, I'm going to take it back to put it in perspective for the today here now. I'm going to take it back to when I started exploring wine here in Las Vegas 20 years ago. So in the early 2000s, if you wanted to buy wine retail, there was very few places to actually buy niche, low intervention natural wine. If not, I mean, honestly, it was really hard to come by. From a retail perspective, the restaurant lists have always been very good in the city, but in the evolution of what you can get now, of course, since then, some of the larger players have come into town, but for a long time it was just Lee's. You'd go and kind of hope to find something interesting at, for me, it was Lee's South Las Vegas Boulevard, because I lived in that area for a long time. So I just wander in there and hope to kind of take what I was learning and had interest in, and hopefully stumble across something that was in the price point that was also looked interesting. And that's how for a long time I bought wine retail. And then leading up to the pandemic, we'll fast forward it to here and now, is when I, like so many industry professionals, had kind of drunk through their personal collection, whether those were samples from prior work that I had, or there's a multitude of ways you can get wine. I actually had to go out and buy wine like a normal human being. And I had been buying from an online retailer that I really enjoyed out of Berkeley. And I thought to myself, after visiting some of the local bottle shops, I had some things I was interested in, but I was like, you know what, there's really not an e-commerce option here in Nevada. And so that was probably 5 months into the pandemic. And I was like, you know what, we're still all, on unemployment. Yes, we're part of this broader industry that is the wine industry. I mean, whether you're on the sales side or the sommelier side, like so many of us in Las Vegas are. And I was like, if I'm having trouble finding the wines that I want, low intervention, natural wines that are a little bit lower ABV, have a lighter footprint, not the real serious muscular wines that you want to have with food that are, leaning into those trophy styles, but just good everyday wine. Something maybe in that $30, $35 price point. It was really hard to find those locally and consistently as well. And then it was kind of a chore to get them. And, you kind of had to, spend a lot of time just, some people like the hunt, but, before I had, our 3-year-old, I enjoyed the hunt too, but I was also kind of thinking to myself, like, okay, there's other people who are like me. They want affordable wine, good wine, and they're also looking for that efficiency. So that was the idea behind KellySOMM originally. And then the journey really started once I had the idea, which was licensing and the proper permits.
I can't think of a question right now.
That's okay.
Do you want to have any questions, Steve?
I mean, I just think, just talk a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of your operation, and just like for someone who has no idea what you do, like how would you explain your company to them? And look at Paul when you respond, just so the eye lines are consistent.
Oh yeah, of course.
I just asked him a question.
I mean, honestly, even people who are close to me don't even necessarily understand the nuts and bolts of the operation. Like I said earlier today, I was like, my dad doesn't even understand my company, and he's an intelligent guy. And so essentially, by the way of securing the license to be able to open an operation like this is, and I'm happy to share what I know because it's an interesting it's an interesting journey. Is I had assistance in drafting up the legal documentation for what I wanted to do using the framework that's available in most other states. Just simple e-commerce operation for low ABV, which could be sake, wine, beer. And so after that was drafted up, I needed to find within the greater Las Vegas area. We technically have 3 different cities that we work with, and I needed to find that flexibility within the jurisdictions here. And the most flexible jurisdiction is North Las Vegas when it comes to zoning, and especially around alcohol. And so even though it's going pretty into the minutia of it, is you have to be within a certain distance of schools, churches. You can't be in the same strip mall as any cannabis operations. It's very heavily regulated. So just finding somewhere that I could use as an operation took about 7 months. And from there, I knew that I wanted to operate like other e-commerce stores. I needed to put up a website that had the selections available, but I also wanted to offer the flexibility for me as the artistic side of the wine industry, which is the product I'm excited about. It's like there's of course, the nuts and bolts of operating any business and making it as efficient, even if I'm learning along the way how to do that. But the true impetus was at its core of like the producers I care about. So because I can pick those up quickly and buy those whenever I'm ready, which the rest of the city can't necessarily do unless you're an independent license, but we know the majority of the revenue in Las Vegas is generated from these casinos, which don't buy product quickly. It takes a very long time for them to bring in new products. And so that is the advantage that I have in this particular market, which is a unique market. And then building hand-selected offerings from those producers that I'm excited about, but a balanced offering, an offering that maybe for somebody who wants only sparkling wines, but then kind of being able to offer within multiple categories, pet nat, maybe some classic sparklings, maybe ones that are a little bit leaner, more mineral driven, where some are rounder and richer, showing deliberate oxidation. So I always think I take that into consideration when I'm making my selections, and I have the most fun with the wine clubs where people can sign up for reoccurring shipments and give me parameters of the styles they're looking for. Some people like really natty wines, which is a category I've had fun exploring in this market because it is still an undeveloped segment, and getting to taste new producers that are also new to me sometimes. And then those low intervention, which kind of could be those classic veins where you could be classic Alsatian producers that are still considered low intervention but drink classically, and then of course leaning into the other category that I mentioned as well. So I think about all of those factors when operating KellySOMM and wanting to create an inventory base to work off of that I already have on hand. But of course, because I am I'm a single operator, owner, solopreneur. And so I also have to balance that with what I'm able to do. And of course, hoping that the clients that I currently have continue to spread the word of what I do by word of mouth, because it is a niche, very niche offering that I have. And that's basically how I operate 2 years into starting the business, but truly after all the licensing and getting this physical space, I've been more or less about 18 months fully operational.
And when you say in the last couple of years, what's some feedback from people that have tried the wines and maybe tried something that they hadn't had before? Has there been some experiences of a light bulb moment for people that are experiencing KellySOMM for themselves and building their palate?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that as a at the core of like the skill set of being a sommelier, and then developing the rest of your experience and understanding the industry is that interpretation of what people are looking for. Like, how do they want it to drink on the palate? How do they want it to taste? Wine is like art. It's very subjective. What I like, somebody else may not like. But being able to interpret something you send, and then maybe picking 2 out of the selection that they really love. I'll give a specific example. I recently, I have a customer who relocated from California, and they are very worldly. They eat at Michelin they're fantastic diners. They eat at Michelin restaurants all around the world, but they found my service and have become really good clients of mine, and also friends as well. And so I recently sent them a variable package of pet nats. And so 6 pet nats, and they really, really, really keep on leaning towards anything that is Chenin Blanc based. And I was like, okay, so not only, are the sparkling wines from the Loire Valley really unique and mineral driven, and have these can have those like woolly stainless steel, but then that like sweet tart profile. I know you know what I'm talking about, but those like candies that we used to eat as kids, those like that like chalky kind of mineral, but like sweet and tart at the same time. I was like, okay, well, I think that they're Chenin Blanc fans, but it may only be in the sparkling form. But then my follow-up shipment to them the next month was, okay, let's explore like Chenin Blanc, but in non-sparkling. So I sent 2 examples of that. One was deliberately oxidative by its style, also a low intervention producer. And then the other was a more classic, like bright, racy, like mineral driven style, but both were on the drier spectrum, because that client of mine also doesn't necessarily like sweet wines, but I think that they do like this varietal. So just kind of like, I keep notes on everybody that I send wine to, especially if they're asking for specific, just like anybody who has an ongoing relationship, that they're trying to understand, what their favorite items are for drinking. Like if they have any dislikes or likes, I just notate that and continue to make the best selections that I can as I'm working through new inventory that I'm excited to be working with. That's kind of how it goes. It's a little bit of a process, and it's just me leaning on my skill set of understanding the wine world, and of course what we have access to as well, which becomes better and better, I think, every year in Las Vegas.
Because in a sense, you're still a floor sommelier. You just having communication through your site. It's
true. It's a little bit of a forced evolution, because like I mentioned, like certain things change in everybody's life. I mean, and for a lot of us, a lot of things changed for us all over the last couple of years. But I approach it from a floor sommelier standpoint and perspective. And I also try to select wines that are food friendly. And that's the other thing too that I really want to spread the wine gospel about is, yes, okay, you can be like, wine is a beautiful beverage on its own, but it's really designed to enhance food. And I think just the simple suggestion when you go on the site and you see something that may stylistically or profile-wise like sound good to you, I also try to make at least one recommendation on what to eat it with, what to pair it with at home, but nothing that's too complicated to prepare. Often I use examples that maybe I recently tried it with at home. I'm really lucky because Kinson, my husband, he's very humble. He calls himself just like a home cook, but he's like, his skills are insane. So that helps too. That helps in the enjoyment and just bringing home, like sometimes he doesn't really care for super, super natty wines, but we'll try them together. He leans more classic. And so sometimes I'll sneak in an officially categorized natural wine, but that is just not funky. But it's like, I know you know what I'm talking about. It could be like a natural wine, but just it happens to drink really clean in that expression. Like Christina Rosé would be an example. That rosé from Carnuntum is such a crowd pleaser, but like she's a natural wine producer. So that would be an example where I'm like, okay, it's Zweigelt, It's really pretty and has like, it's dry, but it still has like those like strawberry, raspberry notes and like some pink flowers. But you could put it in front of anybody and they'll love it. So I also kind of like to sneak in those like natural wines at home to pair with and try foods with. And then if it's something really funky like Nestorak, which like I have enjoyed getting to know that producer a lot from the Czech Republic, because it's not very often that even classically trained somms lean into Czech Republic. So that's been a journey to get to know their style, their house style, and get to share it with other people and to see their reaction. And it's always mixed. Some people love it, and some people it's not their cup of tea, but that's okay too.
You've got so many people that are just willing to enjoy wine outside of food, and it's like trying to acclimate people to do some more food and wine together. But how would you say for those wines that people have to have? They have to have an Oregon Pinot. They have to have a Napa Cabernet. How do you find a way to navigate around that when it's was, for lack of a better, maybe more pedestrian palate, or just how do you get people to try new stuff and trust you?
I always try to start with a dialogue, and I have realized too that there's a reason that Chardonnay and Cabernet and Pinot Noir, especially domestic, are popular. I mean, there's a reason there's a demand for it, and I find that I always try to feature the in-demand varietals, and I'll as well use a specific example. Steve Mathiassen's wines are delicious, and yes, they drink classic. I mean, technically, he is a low intervention, producer. His Napa Cab it's premium. I mean, it's premium. It's above premium. It's pretty. It's a nice bottle of wine. It's retails, for about high 60s, low 70s, and so it's not a small spend for Napa Cab. Occasionally I can find one that's really reasonable, like in the mid 50s, but still, although I know we're talking about servicing those in-demand varietals, I also think too, when people give me an opportunity to talk about it, is you have to look at the wine world from a global perspective, in that making wine in the United States is actually really expensive. The cost of land is expensive. Our labor is expensive. Getting the wine to market is expensive. You're off. And so I think it's natural for people who are entrenched in the industry to just automatically know where to go to get this this price value ratio. And it's not a poor reflection at all about anything that we do domestic, because our wine market is very robust, and it is the quality is there. But I also think too is that could you go to across the border into Germany and get a Pinot Noir that has, that's 7 generations deep, where the land has been paid off for, and they've already paid for their equipment, and they're just operating off of know-how, and they don't have expensive UC Davis degrees to pay off. And it's not, and I'm not trying to I'm just it's just fact, It's fact to look at these different factors and think about, okay, so if I want to drink Pinot Noir, there's a handful of places that they do it really well. And so I will always try to offer something that is in demand, so I don't want to turn anybody away from being a customer, but I also deliberately go out of my way to try to utilize the information that I've naturally collected, my institutional knowledge, and I try to use that to run a better operation, but with the end goal of giving people the best wine that I know how to source, and of course while supporting the Nevada wholesalers, which is, ultimately that's what it's about. Like, Nevada cannot have better wine if we don't support the ecosystem, which is all of the wholesalers here. And yes, there's the big boys in town and the mid-tier and the little distributors, but if they all have niche product they're trying to bring to market, I'm just one more stop, and hopefully, have a bright long future ahead of me. But I know you were asking like specifically about like Napa Cabs or even Oregon Pinots or even domestic Chardonnays. There are producers that I really am excited about that I rotate through the offerings. They're not always necessarily the most competitive though when it comes to how they're listed because of those economic reasons. And it's, that's like the agriculture world as well.
Absolutely. That was a great answer. You did mention Czech Republic earlier. What would you say are some like way under the radar, like little wines that are unexpected and gems around the world, that you're into at the moment?
Wow. Oh yeah, okay, so there are a couple areas of the world that I'm genuinely excited about, and it's because I didn't necessarily always get a chance to work with them in a more traditional setting, in a more structured environment, where you had to try to select things that you knew were going to be in demand. And so like I mentioned, like the Czech Republic, so Nestorak has been a joy to learn about, and then Šída, which is Austria. Those wines are incredible, and they have so much to say, but it's not the kind of wine that you're going to open up and drink by itself. It's like you need to open it up. They're very cerebral, and they are also low ABV, which I also love. They're not giants, at 17% alcohol. They tend to lean towards like 11 or 12%. And specifically the Šída wines, I've had them, so far. I mean, I'm still working my way personally through some of the inventory that I try to, everything that I bring in, I eventually will work my way through at least one bottle in due time. I like to space it out, so I enjoy it too. There's some inventory that I buy blind, because if I don't, it's just gonna, when I'm coming back around to wanting it, it won't be there. And so the Šída wines are an example of that. I brought in about 8 SKUs total, and I've worked my way through about half of them, and they're so interesting and so well made, but they're not necessarily they're esoteric. They're esoteric. They have a lot to say. They're very mineral driven, lean, and like those low ABV kind of we talked about, like very, they're just austere, and I'm growing personally to love that profile, but I don't necessarily, it's not an everyday wine. Those are like when you're in the mood and you want to think about and ponder what is in your glass. Hopefully share it, maybe watch it open up over a couple hours, like have a sip while you're maybe starting to think about preparing dinner, come back 10, 15 minutes later, have another sip, see what it's turned into, and then repeat and repeat and repeat, through 20, 30 sips, right? And it always changes, and those wines I think are the most interesting wines, but it's something that you have to be into. Like, not everybody's into that. Some people, that just like doesn't even sound interesting to them, and I also recognize that. So on some days I don't want wine like that at all. Some days I want like a funky Basque cider that's like 6%, and it tastes good with a sandwich, and it's to me it tastes good with a sandwich, because we're not in Basque country. If we were, I would have it with like some cool like tapas, I'd like drink it with some like potatoes and aioli at a tapas bar or something, or some jamon serrano or something like that was more a specialty of that region. But because we are in Las Vegas, Nevada, I was like, oh, maybe I'll grab like a proper sandwich like company, like they're like Italian sandwich is also super good with that. I know because I've had it. And so I think that those are like just parts of the world I'm excited about. And I'm also excited about leaning into areas of the world where biodynamic just philosophy isn't new and it's not in vogue. Alsace, of course, like classic. You think that when you're learning like foundational sommelier knowledge and you're like, okay, somebody wants organic wine, is there a region in the world where you don't even have to wonder if you're wrong? Like Alsace, like I hope to like lean into that region more and offer more producers, that eventually, when I'm ready to bring on new selections, can like be that a go-to for all of your like, of course, Pinot Noir they do well, but all of the noble white varietals as well. Like that's, that's a given. But then the less obvious is, I mentioned earlier about the producer Christina. So like that area, I'm starting to realize, thanks to the Jenny and Francois portfolio, that hasn't really been represented that long in Nevada, but is 20 years into New York City, so they're not new wines, but maybe new to us geographically as far as having access in a daily basis, is a lot of those producers that are on the border of Austria and Hungary, in the Lake Neusiedlersee. My pronunciation may not be perfect, but that area I'm finding has a really a stronghold of biodynamic producers, and they've been doing it for hundreds of years, and that's just the way of life for that region. And so I think that kind of working my way through some of those producers also is a journey for myself also.
Fantastic. You had some cool questions, Steve?
Just on a philosophical level, can you talk about the connection, is civilization has evolved, wine's evolved, and there's been kind of this reciprocal nature, between humans and, the beverage. And so just can you talk about the history of wine a little bit more and how things have changed, and how is wine different now than it was in, say, ancient Georgia or in Rome or Greece?
It's getting back to, the roots of civilization and wine and that symbiotic, kind of evolution is, I think from an American perspective, because, I can't remove myself from my upbringing, is for a long time, Americans were, I think, overly concerned with oak and the oak treatment, and the bigger, the better, the bolder, the more obvious was what had, my entire time being in the wine world has always, gotten the most scores, gotten the most press. That style is obvious. It's not super nuanced, and that's the opposite of where civilization started with wine. And those wines are, tested for, their phenolics, their brix, their acidity. And so it's very scientific to get to that point, and very deliberate to find the warmest regions and, like I said, source the oak treatment that's going to give it the boldest profile. And that's the opposite of where wine started. Where wine started was, we talk about native yeast, not lab yeast, but native yeast that are not particularly rigorous. They only have the ability when wine is made in with the ambient yeast to really get to 11%. That's pretty common, and rarely could they go above that. And if you go to the most ancient winemaking, they were using clay amphora vessels. Even the Egyptians, in a lot of the tombs, I think they just are revisiting. I saw in the news earlier today, 100 years since Tutankhamun's tomb was discovered, and they find new treasures, and there's always remnants of wine. And so that it's always been man's best friend, so to speak, from a very natural beverage. When it comes to just grapes can grow in extreme climates, they can grow almost anywhere in the world, and that yeast that is native to the house that maybe it was fermenting in, or someone's ancient shed, or whatever their equivalent environment is, that is what natural wine is about. Which I think people are getting back to those sources of, okay, you see a lot of producers that are using those neutral amphoras, only using ambient yeast. And even though there's classic producers that have also been doing that in regions Burgundy, for example, is a big believer of that natural yeast in the environment and not using cultivated yeast. But you take that a step further to the natural movement in the natural wine world, I think that people are getting back to that. They want to enjoy product that's made in a more simple manner. Now, I will say that we have, just like anything that we have the ability to lean in modern, we think about it, just modern technology and temperature controlled, is that I will say that because I am coming at it from an American perspective, is like there are people in the wine world, whether it be domestic producers or European, old world, new world, you can go all over the globe, who are taking it that hands-off approach, like no temperature control, native yeast, biodynamic if they can, no chemicals. However, there are times where like maybe you need a temperature controlled environment. That is great to have if you need it to help make the best wine that you can. And when I say temperature controlled, we're talking about like stainless steel. Like, those vats, they can control the temperature. So the fermentation maybe, can be dialed down if it gets too hot and too vigorous. So that's, I don't know if it like answers your question directly, but I think that, natural wine at its core is getting back to basics and not using science to chase a popular profile. Just kind of letting the wine do its own thing. And even if it's funky, and being okay with that.
Well, it seems like the technology just kind of, like very many other aspects of our existence, it just kind of overwhelmed the wine industry. And a lot of people now are realizing, like, if you drink a lot of the wines from California, you're going to have one of the worst hangovers in the world. And a lot of it might have to do with the chemicals or what's in the soil. Mm-hmm. And so, this whole push to go back to the old ways, just tell me a little bit about, how the technology kind of overwhelmed the artistic side of wine, and now that move to kind of getting back in touch with the old world methods.
The old world methods are, I can tell you talk to somebody who was born and raised in the old world and has done nothing but make artisanal wine their whole life, and it's just talking about it from anything other than an artistic perspective. That's the only relationship that they have with what they're doing. It's about honoring the land first, and the land that they, where the grapes are coming from, and like honoring the entire ecosystem and the other animals and the other, the insects, the sheep often, the bovine on there. They have to have each other to make a healthy environment. And so that is first and foremost about what it is that they're concerned about. Next is that has to happen first. And then the health of the vines, Mother Nature. How is Mother Nature treating, their land and them that year? And then assuming all goes well when it comes to the land, the weather, next, of course, is them taking the most hands-off approach, short of like, hand harvesting and letting that ambient yeast. And then, of course, them keeping, not necessarily, again, like from the old world perspective is, they have a clean environment, but it's not sterile. Like their environment that they're working in is like an extension of the land. It's, it's like they're using usually neutral oak, usually often like, they of course want well-maintained vessels for whatever they're fermenting, but sometimes they're still like foot trodden. They're using, these like, often these older techniques and going for that funkier style, which is now becoming more and more popular. But that is, I even have to watch myself when I talk to specifically like European from a classical like sense. I've learned that I have to be very careful with how I talk about wine, because we talk about it in the US as a wine business, and just that coming out of my mouth is a huge turnoff, because they have an operation to run, but it's about making the best product that they can. They're not overly obsessed. Like wine is like food. It would, to them, it would be like saying, I'm gonna cook like a Thanksgiving dinner, or I'm gonna cook a Christmas ham, but instead of it being the act of cooking your Christmas ham or your Thanksgiving turkey, like imagine if it wasn't just about making something delicious to enjoy. Like that's how they're truly looking at their wine. They're making something delicious that they care about, that they believe in, which is often maybe like they have a family history in doing. Not always the case, but it very much often is. It's about making the best product they can from the land that they're working, and that final expression being either the expression they've always done or expression they deeply care about. It's not necessarily about the return on investment, and that would be like costing out your turkey dinner, or your ham dinner, and then deciding that you weren't going to make it the way that you wanted it because the economic return wasn't there. And it's like if food and wine is a right in their point of view. And in the US, we're always look at the wine industry as like, okay, yes, everyone has to cover their overhead, but they're looking at it from my observation the last 20 years is it's overly scientific. It's now become overly data driven. And when you go to enter a segment, they often, for commercial wineries that are high volume, and we haven't even gotten into like the mega purple or any of the other chemicals that are legally allowed, but it is like, okay, we're gonna rip up old heritage, Zinfandel in California because there's no longer demand. But what we are gonna plant is, thousands of acres of Moscato because that's what Nielsen's data tells us is gonna be in demand for the next 10 years. I mean, it happens all the time, but is that what's good for the longevity of the industry? I mean, some would say that that's just how businesses should be run, but I also think too, it's like whatever happened to the art of making something that just should be delicious. And I've learned that, there's like in any industry, there's like the artist, and then there's like the bean counter's business, and there's something to be learned from both. But the wines that I care about, the wines that like speak to me, the wines that I want to drink, that I find interesting, that I want to spend my own time and my savings to start a business, like are the wines that are the small production, more natural, low intervention wines. And I know I didn't even talk about Mega Purple yet, but yeah, I mean, people are allowed to manipulate wine. There's no rules against it. There's, there are some guidelines on what you can and can't do, but there is a list of, you can acidify your wine. You can add Mega Purple, which is essentially, it's essentially, remnants of prior fermentations in the skin and the pigment. But while you do that, I mean, there's some people who really watch like their sulfite intake might be familiar with this, but like everybody has their own internal cup, and if you eat and drink foods that have a lot of additives, like you will eventually start to have a reaction. And I didn't know it at the time, it's not, polite to say like the producer, but there was a producer that I was drinking casually maybe 12 years ago at a wine dinner that I went to, that I was invited to. And I thought I was having an allergic food reaction, and I realized the next day it was reaction to the wine, and it was a Southern Hemisphere wine, but it was made in a style that was deliberately very extracted. It had a ton of Mega Purple in it. It drank with like the highest alcohol that it could have, with the most extraction, with the most, it probably had wood chips in it, truth be told. So it's like you take all of these factors and like, yeah, people might like how it tastes, and maybe it's kind of like cutting your teeth on Coca-Cola. If you cut your teeth on Coca-Cola and these really sugary drinks, like as an adult, you may lean into those wine styles. And if that's what you like, that's okay. But I think people should know that that's not natural. Like wine does not come out of nature tasting like that. Like it needs help from the human side to get that way.
Cool. I guess maybe just one last question. What does the future of wine look like, and how is the industry going to change moving forward? Because, it just seems like this industry is constantly in flux, and new things are becoming more popular. People want things more sustainable, and, moving into a world where we have more climate change issues to deal with, that's going to change the future of farming in general. So, just tell me a little bit about the future.
I mean, I'm still optimistic of the future, because if you're curious, you can learn as much as you ever wanted to learn. So I think that that's a good thing about the current state of understanding the industry and the producers, but as like an actual wine drinker and where the industry is going, I do think that people vote with their dollars. People vote by, drinking what they're interested in. So I'm optimistic about the natural wine movement and where it's going. It's still, you see it continue to grow, and that's a great, in my perspective, that's great. However, with that being said, there's an understanding that I think all coming from an American lens is wine is finite when it's artisanal. There's only so much land that these vignerons or these winemakers are working, and understanding that the production is what it is every year, and that it's often typically quite small for the segment we're talking about for low intervention and natural wine. So that is a positive thing, because I think it brings people in a digital age. I mean, it's an e-commerce, and KellySOMM is e-commerce, so even though I'm leaning into technology to spread awareness, like the product, the wine is artisanal and small. And I think that's going to become more and more important as, this like new chapter that we all find ourselves in continues to evolve, because that sense of place, like what it's all about, like the grower, the vineyard, the geography, how was Mother Nature that year, what is the soil, what's the culture of that area, what's the food that the locals eat, that is more important than ever, because people do feel less connected. They don't necessarily always feel like they belong, I find, as you are entering this digital age. And so being able to have a product that physically comes from somewhere, that's tied to a tradition, that's tied to a language, that's tied to the people behind it, I feel very positive about that, because it brings people back to things that matter, like no matter who you are, like those things matter. And sometimes we don't always feel connected, especially, in the future where the world is going and how we all do work.